I don't have a commentator. You can ask as many questions as you want. Anyone have any questions, you can ask it. So, my name is Robert Henry. I'm a professor at Gateway Community Technical College. I'm a doctoral fellow at the Institute for Lutheran Theology, Lutheranism, and German philosophy going hand in hand. So I'm a doctoral fellow there. I'm the assistant editor for the Verba Vitae, which is a kind of a new burgeoning publication there. So that's kind of me. And I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio. And I'm just astounded by the beauty around me. This is, dude, this is, like, Portland is, wow. I want to move here. I mean, Cincinnati, and the food's way better too. I mean, the food, we got Skyline chili. We don't have any really good, we're not people get food. So that's me. So I'll give you the abstract to the paper and then we'll get into it. I'll just go ahead and read it. I would normally, I had a slide presentation, but I'm just going to read the paper. We'll bore you with the long version of it. Okay, so in this paper, I evaluate Martin Heidegger's view on disclosure of Dasein and provide comparisons of disclosure with classical and modern arguments for revelationist understanding. In that, Heidegger argued that how we come to know the world is through the disclosure of Dasein, which is a more tenable position than the common view. Now, Dasein, just to kind of give you a brief sort of backdrop, Dasein is a German word which means in the world. So Martin Heidegger was arguing that everything that exists is in the world, right? Including the I. That's what he distanced himself from Husserl, because Husserl felt, or the way that he didn't articulate this, but Husserl, the way he sort of framed his arguments was that you had an I, or individual, and then you had the world. Well, Heidegger is like, no. The I, the ego, is in the world. So if the ego is in the world, it's part of Dasein. So this is why he developed this term Dasein. So he felt that disclosure of Dasein, which is a more tenable position than the common view of representational realism. Representational realism is just the idea that I'm perceiving something, the perception is somehow being interpreted in my brain. There's a tiny Robert in my brain that's looking at the screen, right? And this is very much anti-representationalism, phenomenology. So he's coming in from that. So I argue that this disclosure, which is the basis for how we know the world, is best understood in terms of a divine revelation. That there's this foundation of being, you can call it God, you can call it the divine, whatever, which reveals itself and the world. And this is a form of disclosure, but in contrast to Heideggerian disclosure. So I argue that that disclosure is best understood in terms of divine revelation, rather than a rationalistic, phenomenologically normative process, which is objective, empirical process. All right. So in Martin Heidegger's Being and Time, the German philosopher lays out a thorough analysis of phenomenologically disclosed being, its disclosure of time, and a variety of topics related to said analysis. In the course of his observations, Heidegger expressed serious concerns with how the topic of being had been treated in classical philosophy, particularly with respect to Descartes. He had a huge problem with Descartes. And if you read Being and Time, you'll immediately see that he had some major issues with René Descartes. So more specifically, Descartes' ontological bifurcation of the extended, the matter, the world or the material, and the non-extended, which is mind, in which that which thinks demonstrates a significant point of departure from Heidegger's views. So in contrast, Heidegger's vision of Dasein, or being in the world, exhausts the totality of being. In other words, all of being is in the world. So how understanding and the interpretation of the entities in Dasein is achieved, how that's achieved, how we understand things, is through disclosure. It discloses itself. Dasein discloses itself. And it discloses itself in a variety of ways. Through everydayness. These are terms that Heidegger used. Everydayness. Mood, or moods. A sense of thrownness, which is a sense of being in the world. And I always think of that song by The Doors, where it says, I'm thrown into this world. I mean, I'm not saying that Jim Morrison was a Heidegger scholar by any means, but he's certainly expressing a very similar sentiment that Heidegger was expressing in his thrownness. And thus, a falling away that discloses its totality. While the traditional view of understanding or epistemic achievement seems to rely heavily on representationalism as a traditional view of epistemology. And by the way, we'll talk about this a little bit later, Heidegger was not big on epistemology. He felt that ontology was much more important. So he founds the serious flaws with representationalism. As I propose, a more tenable facilitation of achieving epistemic understanding is encompassing more of a totality of being, and that is revelation, divine revelation. In this paper, I evaluate Martin Heidegger's view of disclosure of Dasein and provide comparisons of disclosure with classical and modern arguments for revelation as understanding. So there are a couple different ways we can understand revelation. There's the classical view, and there's some more modern views of revelation, divine revelation. Arguments for as an understanding. I argue that this disclosure is best understood in terms of a divine revelation rather than a rationalistic, phenomenologically normative process. So disclosure as epistemic facilitation. So unpacking the phenomenological method that Heidegger employed, particularly when it comes to Dasein and being in the world. This is to individualize Dasein, which would not make any sense if Daseins were just individuals. So we have Dasein. We can't really look at Daseins, but we look at Dasein, the totality of being in the world. On the other hand, if Dasein is initially something public, then it makes perfect sense to say that individuals can own it, can make it their own in the sense of taking responsibility for it, and thereby individualize it. This therefore solves the problem of other minds, subjectivity and supposed logical tension with objective reality. For Dasein is both the subjective and objective sense without an ontological distinction of type. Rather, there's an ontical distinction that when Dasein is disclosed reveals this lack of contradiction. And I wish I could stop every time and explain the distinction that Heidegger makes between because you might hear the word ontical and ontological and go, is that the same thing? For Heidegger, it's not the same thing. But I don't really have time to go into it, but it's not really that important at this point because we're just going to be talking about how Dasein is disclosed. Heidegger's method, therefore, identifies disclosure as the medium through which understanding is achieved. In other words, how we understand Dasein, it discloses itself. Or more succinctly, this serves as the definition of understanding. Neither realism nor idealism, Heidegger's phenomenology, by ignoring the foundations of the philosophical subject-object distinction, because in phenomenology that's not even even recognized as a distinction, found a philosophical satisfying solution to these problems. And while they are hardly naturalistic in the modern sense of the word, the process of disclosure is a deterministic, naturalistic process in its own right. So in other words, it's when I say it's hardly naturalistic, what I'm saying is that it's not a scientific, positivistic, empirically verifiable physical process. But it is naturalistic in the sense that it's deterministic. It's not based on some volition or some agency outside of reality that's making all this stuff happen. And while they're, so 4, a public understanding of being that is, according to me, unowned Dasein consists of 1, normal ways of finding out what is the case, 2, normal constraints on what is possible, and 3, a general norm not to accept as true anything that would be impossible. These normal ways, or natural laws of Dasein, seem to rather deterministic, as if under certain conditions disclosure has to operate in such a way as we observe it. As such, the philosophical project is best understood in terms of how we come to know anything at all. But to the phenomenologist, it isn't a situation where we dig, like a paleontologist, but rather identify what is right there in front of us. The suggestion that philosophy should be grounded in what shows itself, what is self-evident or manifest in itself, is hardly unprecedented. So that's a quote from Heidegger himself. And therefore, disclosedness, or how Dasein is disclosed, works on not merely our own rational capacities, but also on our mood and sense of being in the world. Disclosedness is therefore always present, but always potentially disclosed. This is why in Heidegger's being time, distinguishing the ready to hand as ontologically disclosed from the present to hand, ontically disclosed, in a vague potentiality may very well represent this false dichotomy philosophers had for millennia had spoken on as the subject or the idea and the object material extent. just to give you kind of a background of the present hand, the present to hand and the ready to hand. These are terms. Think of going into a tool shed and you see a hammer. Now, if I'm going to use a hammer, that is, I'm going to be using it. I have a purpose for it. But if I see it and I have not used it before, it's just there. So what Heidegger is doing is make a distinction between things that we use and things that we don't use, but are still there in reality. So a lot of what we can see between the subject-object distinction, all of these things that we had seen traditionally in the more classical philosophical distinctions, he would say could be found in those two distinctions. Instead of subject to object, is it something that's useful for me, or is it something that's just out in the world that's present? Right? So thus, disclosiveness is the discoveredness of Dasein's own being. But this does not position the mind in a privileged place in the world, but rather as a process that is just as equiprimordial. And the word equiprimordial means that it doesn't have one thing causing the other. It's not emerging, nor is it coming down, emanating, right? So it's the same, it's there in reality. Like, a lot of people say consciousness is an emergent property of neurons. For Heidegger, he would say, well, it's just there. And, the neurons are not the primordial source of consciousness, but they're equiprimordial. So, going back to that, is extended material features that are merely Dasein-ontically expressed, disclosed, or in relation to itself. Revelation is epistemic facilitation, theologico-philosophical tradition. On first reading Heidegger, one may get the sense that his philosophical writings are as removed from theology as Kant or even Nietzsche. But as seen in the writings of Karl Rahner or Pannenberg, there is a clear association of theological things of Heidegger. So we see a very close relationship. In fact, one of my old professors, he claims that Heidegger was at the time, the most prominent scholar of Martin Luther. Now, a lot of people debate that, and they're like, no way he was. But some people debate. So he was very familiar with German theology. So from his surprisingly eschatological treatment of the nowness of death in a vague, albeit phenomenologically compelling and Christian complementarian perspective to situating all experience, even religious experiences, within an authentic and thus theologically consistent view of experience. Revelation as epistemology is not mere without a variety of perspectives. One is that revelation relates specifically to God alone, and knowledge of nature is presented in the traditional way. This is quite Thomistic. St. Thomas Aquinas, Thomistic. And the traditional view of the Roman Catholic Church. And not just Catholics, but also many Reformed thinkers. Consider Karl Barth. Good old Karl Barth. I love Karl, he's great. And his view, Barth was not in the least interested in demonstrating a religious a priori. Quite the contrary. We might accurately put Barth's concern by saying that he was interested in proclaiming the independence of revelation, and with that, an ineradicable difference between the knowledge of God and the knowledge of the creature. So we're seeing a really robust view of Barth, and let's see, where's that quote from? That is from Bruce McCormick in Revelation and History and Transfoundationalist Perspectives, scholar of Barth. So some of the earliest expressions of revelation as epistemology is in the Platonic. Yay, we get to go back to Plato. Are you guys undergraduate? Okay, in philosophy? Yay, you're reading Plato. Yes, good. Just keep reading Plato, it's great. It's all Plato, in the words of C.S. Lewis. No, I'm just kidding. Some of the earliest expressions of revelation, as I said, is in the Platonic and later Augustinian tradition of illumination. Ultimately, what is revealed as true is illuminated, much like the sun illuminates the world around us. In this allegorical model, coming to know anything is how the intellect is revealed such epistemic content. That's how it's revealed. Let's see, I gotta look at these quotes. Okay, from Robert Wood, Plato, Descartes, and Heidegger. He's a scholar on those three individuals and more. What he tells us is the one can move up from ignorance toward purely intelligible relations, and finally toward the one in the light of which intellectual development occurs. Intellectual movement seeks unity in what would otherwise be scattered multiplicity. Intellect moves in the light of the deep desire for unification, correlate to eros, moved by beauty. Oneness is what it seeks, hence the good is the one, is its illuminating source. And in that, we almost see Plato as being very reminiscent of like Eastern philosophy, right? Where you have the many, and the many are seeking to come back to the one. A lot of ancient Greek thinkers thought that too, like the conflagration, everything's going back to to fire or whatever its primary element is. So it's very similar to that. But of course, for Plato, it's this kind of abstract realm. So likewise, Augustine embraced a similar and clearly one influenced by the father of Neoplatonism model of knowledge. But whereas Plato treated God as some, in the most grotesque rendering, a mechanistic God like emanation, and a more generous rendering, one where God is a transcendent apophatic source. Apophatic meaning kind of, you don't really know much about it as apophatic. You can't say anything about God, just like, it's all you can say. You can't even say that. You can't even say that. It's just there. It's the divine. So Augustine elevated God, the Christian God, to the intimate, active, and immediate cause of illumination. So he had a more specific source for illumination, as opposed to this kind of apophatic, cloud of mysticism or whatever. However, this is distinguished from Heideggerian disclosiveness by its necessary grounding in the sovereignty, agency, and will of God. Augustine goes on to explain that suppose I wanted to look upon the sun and were able to do so steadily, it would desert me at sunset. It would leave me at sunset. The steadfastness, reliability, and character of God ensures in this reflection of revelation that God is a revealer of knowledge and truth, is grounded in the personal nature of God. And so, revelation, in contrast to disclosedness, grounds epistemic priority to the agency, special and ordinary revealing of God's nature, and the nature of experience in some traditions to the individual. Whereas disclosedness is a quasi-naturalistic, or at the very least a non-apparent form of God's revelation proper, as expressed in the theologian Stikust, and many more, is non-naturalistic and is the foundation for natural law and the naturalistic empirically observed events and entities involved. So in that really strange and confusing paragraph, basically I'm just making a distinction between revelation, where you have an agency that's revealing things, and you have this naturalistic process of disclosing itself. Right? So, and what I'm arguing is that revelation, unlike disclosedness, also includes agency, whereas disclosedness has no agency at all. It's just a naturalistic, mechanistic sort of process, right? So, okay. I don't remember what page I'm on. As such, the philosophical project is best understood in terms of how we come to know anything at all. But to the phenomenologist, it isn't a situation where we dig, like a paleontologist, but rather identify what is right there in front of us. The suggestion that philosophy should be grounded in what shows itself, what is self-evident or manifest itself, is hardly precedented. All right. Now, how revelation is a preferable model of epistemic facilitation than disclosedness. So this is where the rubber meets the road. How is it revelation is preferable? Why is it better than Heideggerian disclosedness? Considering Barth and his commitment to revelation as epistemology, at least with respect to his dogmatics, which is this huge work that he wrote, we're talking huge, right? If you put it on your hard drive, it's probably going to take away, it's huge. And approach to theology, the stark contrast between quasi-naturalistic a process like disclosedness, and that of the personal, intentional, and volitional act of revelation by God. Revelation, therefore, is not only a foundation for what is known, but the means by which knowledge is acquired. In a similar manner, as Heidegger maintains that Dasein is disclosed to us, so too is revelation, a revealing to us. Barth is here is obviously not suggesting that Scripture is the content of this revelation, any more than Heidegger would suggest that our thoughts of the disclosure of Dasein. So what I'm saying there is, Karl Barth, for example, being a Christian, is not saying that Scripture or the tradition of Christianity is the means by which revelation occurs. That's just how his understanding of it is. And the same way with Heidegger. Heidegger's not saying that disclosedness is something that goes on here. It's out here. It's out here, right? Rather, we must do the hard work of reflecting on this revelation through historical, traditional, hermeneutical, I love that word, just great. You just throw that out in a dinner party and just like, right? It's a great word. Hermeneutical, homiletical, that just means like giving speeches, and typically it's associated with like telling stories from a pulpit if you're a preacher or something. Homiletical and scriptural analysis of this revelation. One can compare this to the process of disclosure with Heidegger's present to hand, ready to hand, and how through circumspection, the sense of thrownness that bears on Dasein's care and its mood, which sets the preconditions for disclosure, knowledge can be attained.
Can you repeat? Present to hand?
Yeah, that, I know, this is a long...
So, present to hand and the
I'm going to repeat that, and I'm going to unpack that, because that's a really pregnant sentence. There's a lot there. Okay. So, rather, we must do the hard work of reflecting on this revelation through historical, traditional... Oh, let me go back. I'm sorry, we already said that. One can compare this to the process of disclosure. So, we're comparing and contrasting revelation with disclosure. This is Heidegger's view. With Heidegger, you have the present to hand. You have the ready to hand. You have, through circumspection, the sense of thrownness that bears on Dasein's care and its mood, which sets the preconditions for disclosure that knowledge, where knowledge can be attained. Which that means is that when you have the present to hand, the ready to hand, when you recognize that something is meaningful to you and you're engaging with it, what happens is you have this condition that Heidegger refers to as Sorge, which is the English word for care, which is very similar to almost like love, right? It's almost like love. It's what glues. It's really, Sorge is the glue that holds all of reality together, right? If you don't have Sorge, if you're not connected, committed to the world around you, you almost don't have being. You're like non-being, like dead, right? In fact, for Heidegger, that's what death is just non-being. Well, that's for everybody. Death is non-being. That's just Heidegger. Okay, so that's basically what that long, pregnant sentence meant. In contrast to the traditional sense that the mind either projects onto the landscape of the extended, the Cartesian model, or even the Kantian structuring of the mind, the popular sense in which Kant, you guys been reading Kant, by the way? Yeah. I was wondering if you got headaches yet? I have some asthma. It's Kant stuff. Great stuff. It can be a headache. Not as bad as Hegel, but he's okay. So where was that? I was good. Okay, Kant resolved or attempted to resolve the issue of knowledge of the phenomenal disclosure of Dasein. First and foremost, sets the individual in that which he or she is observing and trying to understand. The mind would therefore not be some transcendental faculty, but rather a collaborative emerging property of how Dasein comes to know itself and distinguish selves through the various moods and individual experiences. Now remember Kant, and understanding Heidegger from the perspective of Kant. Heidegger and Kant are very closely related because Heidegger is still within the tradition of German idealism in a sense. I hate to use the word idealism because Kant was hardly what we would consider a traditional idealist. But he's still in that because he's trying to understand the conditions for the possibility of experience. What are the preconditions? What can I understand in order to come at experience, right? What are the basic building blocks of experience? And Heidegger's concerned with the same thing, very similar. So the mind would therefore not be some transcendental faculty, but rather a collaborative emerging property. This is similar to the revelation of Barth, which situates the individual in the world of experience and whose knowledge is revealed to him or her by God, not as some epistemic process by which the mind either projects its intellectual powers upon or structures reality in such a way as making it intelligible. And it's hard to believe that reality is intelligible. Sometimes it's intelligible, sometimes it's not. Like today, it wasn't very intelligible, but especially when I ate that really good food today. So, in Diller's dissertation, we find an apocalyptic criticism of justified true belief, or JTB, which was not explicitly stated by Heidegger nor Barth, but is found in Alvin Plantinga's reformulation of reform epistemology in his concept of warrant. And this is what Plantinga tells us. He says, for the insufficiency of most construals of justification for warrant is highlighted in situations where, despite fulfilling by most accounts, one's epistemic duties, there occurs some kind of deception, mistake, or malfunction in the process. So what Diller's arguing for, and what Alvin Plantinga is arguing for as well, is the idea that the traditional way of understanding how we know the world is through justified true belief, which was developed by Plato. Now what he's saying is it's not justified true belief, it's a warrant. You have a warrant to true belief. And a warrant is not something that you can say for sure this way or that. It's just warranted by what's available to us. Right? And that's starting to sound a lot like Heidegger, isn't it? What's available, not stepping outside of reality and analyzing what's true and what's false. You can't do that. We're in the world. So even from the empirical perspective, empirical properties like magic, to where when they come in contact with the mind, they scrape off bits of knowledge that act as grounds for themselves. The epistemic problem of justification is equally as dire. And likewise, it isn't as Kant suggested, the mind can structure itself to where empirical data can be structured without some inductively grounded a priori content that itself can be grounds for the very noumena it presents. Are you guys familiar with the term noumena? Okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, you are. You are, but you guys aren't. Okay. Well, for Kant, you had this distinction of the phenomena and the noumena. The phenomena is that which is available to us in experience. The noumena is outside of experience. We can't say anything about it except the fact that it's noumena. And then you had other guys like Fichte who would say, "Well, you're even talking about noumena, so therefore, Kant, you're wrong." But anyways, that's what noumena is. It's that which we can't experience. Dasein, as disclosing itself, also suffers from the problem of self-justification or sufficiency. If it unfolds on itself, then it accounts of its own entirety is beyond mere enigma. The landscape of justification or knowledge, via disclosure of Dasein by itself for itself, is a rhetorical appeal, but not a thoroughly tenable rationale. Disclosure, acting as a medium by which knowledge is attained, ignores any epistemological foundation that would justify or even warrant such a consistent facilitation. Even if Dasein were folding back on itself, the image itself can't account for a total picture of all that is known by an individual. Needless to say, how Dasein knows Dasein when Dasein is its totality. Dasein would have to step outside of itself, thus cease being Dasein, and then encompass all of Dasein, or traversing its own entirety, would then reflect all that it is. Are you guys familiar with Gödel's incompleteness theorem? Where Gödel theorized that that all that we can say about reality is always going to be incomplete, because there's always going to be something that's outside of what we can know. What I'm saying here is that if Dasein is the means by which we understand the world, right, and it's disclosing itself, then it can't really sufficiently account for the entirety of itself. Because remember, Hegel even said, if you identify a line of demarcation, that necessarily means you've transcended it. Like if I see a line in the sand, then I have to be on the other side of the line to be able to say it's that line. Heidegger, for example, suggests there is a term called, he used, I don't have it here, but I'll talk a little bit about it, horizon. So for him, horizon is this area where you can't see beyond it, right? Because in being in time, time is being disclosed too. In fact, some people may even argue that time itself is us. We are time. That's who we are. The ego is really time in Dasein. But ultimately, when you look, let's say your own demise. Let's say you know you're going to die in 2030 or something, whatever. You can't see beyond that, right? And there's no way you can know anything beyond that. So the horizon for Heidegger is that which you cannot know at this time, because time is still being disclosed. So the horizon, there's something that lies behind the horizon. Now obviously Heidegger would say it's Dasein, but he's still identifying Dasein as that which is the entirety. So it's kind of a paradox, really. That's why I argue that divine revelation is a better model for understanding and how Dasein is disclosed, because it's a transcendent source of knowledge. It's transcendent. It's not in Dasein, it's outside of it. So unlike disclosure, revelation anchors knowledge not in a naturalistic and thus naturally known process, and again, we're going back to the naturally known, but one that involves an agency outside the purview of natural perception or phenomenologically circumspection. God thus serves as the foundation of not only the medium of knowledge, but the perceptual and mental capabilities being elevated by a supervening, transcendent fact. Are you guys familiar with the term supervening? Okay, yes, supervening, yeah. Consider the model of one attempting to climb a mountain without arms and legs. Have you guys seen that movie Holes? Have you, right? Do you remember that part where the Madame Zeroni, she's like, you need to carry me up to the mountain too, so I can be strong, right? Well, that's what's happening here. So knowledge is something that we can't attain by ourselves, by our own natural process. Something has to carry our minds, our abilities beyond what it can do. Now, Heidegger would say it's Dasein, disclosing itself. But it's a naturalistic process, and naturalistic processes are conceptual processes that we understand, that we're climbing up. Revelation involves something that carries us. That carries us up like Madame Zeroni. It's carrying us, doing something we can't do. So the natural abilities of the climber are enabled by another climber, e.g. God or divine, however you call it, or it, or whatever, who its limbs and the ability to carry the lame individual. Likewise, while the mind is unable to account for itself without transcending itself, which is impossible since it would cease to be a mind in doing so, its natural faculties can be supervened by or supernaturally assisted, which I hate that term supernatural because it sounds so woo-like, by God through revelation. Therefore, it seems revelation is capable of addressing this problem that disclosure can't. So revelation seems to be addressing a problem that we find in the model of Dasein's disclosure. It addresses that problem and thoroughly explains it in a better way than disclosure. Conclusion. While Heidegger's Dasein proves a positive development in the discipline of ontology, it's epistemologically, don't ever say epistemology, guys. Don't. No. Epistemology through disclosure. You guys know what epistemology? Yeah, that's how you know things, right? Okay. Yeah, you guys. Yeah, you've taken it. All right. Through disclosure, through demonstrating much resilience to the classical and traditional problems of epistemology is expressed in issues such as other minds. Knowing the external world doesn't quite answer the problems of epistemic sufficiency. And epistemic sufficiency is that principle where knowledge can account for its own faculty of knowing. However, as we've looked at various perspectives on divine revelation, there seems to be a much better explanation of these problems instantiated in revelation over disclosure. Therefore, even though Heidegger's phenomenological approach provides an ontological sufficiency, and guys, he's my favorite philosopher. I love Heidegger. Awesome. I used to be Plato, but now it's... It doesn't provide an adequate epistemology as does divine revelation as represented in Christian theological perspectives we find defended by Origen. Really good if you guys get a chance. You get into theology, read Origen, it's awesome. Augustine, Barth, and others. That's all I got. All right, anybody have any questions?
Well, very interestingly, Ricoeur talks about revelation, and so Paul Ricoeur.
Yeah.
So he argues that the revelation would not have been possible if there had not been writing.
Oh, the revelation of the writing.
Could you comment or reject or?
I think he's probably, and I can't really, I've studied some Ricoeur. I don't know what he means by that. I'm assuming he probably means.
No. So, what we learn in the New Testament
yes.
is as was written, as was said.
Mm-hmm. I would refer back to.
So Jesus
Mm-hmm.
is not saying, I am the Son of God. He says, as it was said. So he inserts himself in a literary tradition that was expecting a Savior.
Yeah, and I would agree with that to some extent, but I wouldn't. I would just say to Ricoeur that that revelation occurs even prior to written language, because revelation, and Barth looks at revelation as that motivation that comes from the divine through the hearts of the individuals. And when we read scripture, or any scripture, and this is Barth's kind of hermeneutical, exegetical, well, not exegetical, hermeneutical way of looking at scripture, is that we don't stand on what the prophets and the prophets and the apostles and anyone that was a follower of any of the great traditions. We don't stand on what they said, but rather we stand on what they were doing, kind of like orthopraxy, and we stand on what was said through them. Right? So we're stepping back. We're not literally reading what they've written down. We're stepping back and we're looking at the actions that were expressed through their lives. And from what we glean from that, that's how we get a divine revelation.
Can I press? And so you take Isaiah.
Yeah.
How would that apply today?
What, Isaiah?
Yeah.
Like in what way?
Well, you say that he was speaking was not enough, that he was testifying was not enough.
Of course.
How is the idea of revelation in your concept present in Isaiah? How do you pronounce Isaiah?
Yeah, well, Isaiah.
Isaiah.
Now remember, Isaiah was a prophet to the Israeli people during a particular time. During that particular time, they were about to be, it was during the, it was what was that? That's 700 BC. So basically, there was a great conflict that the Israeli people were in the midst of and were about to be experiencing, right? So what Isaiah was doing was drawing from past experiences of earlier prophets and explaining to the Israeli people, this is what we need to do. I don't think that that's necessarily a word-for-word situation where we're going to study every word that Isaiah says and glean from it some sort of epistemologically thorough understanding of the divine. Rather, I think that when we read Isaiah, we see how he is drawing from past experiences, how he is drawing from his own personal experiences with God and with his environment, and how he's telling them, the people, that this is what the divine is leading us towards. Now, when we read that, I think that we have to come to it with an attitude of what is the divine doing through Isaiah, as opposed to what is Isaiah specifically saying about X, Y, and Z. Because obviously a lot of fundamentalists who read Isaiah are looking for end times prophecies and all this sort of thing, or you're a sinner, and if you don't turn around, you'll be thrown in the pit. Of course, they didn't believe in the type of hell that was developed through Christianity and the much later, I would say, because even the early Christians didn't believe in eternal hell. But when they're basically weaponizing, I would say, the words of Isaiah, and they're doing that by trying to look at it from an improper hermeneutic. If they look at it from a Barthian, I think they would have a much different perspective. So yeah, that'd be any other questions about Plato, divine revelation?
I have some questions.
No mine. Yeah.
I want to formulate that correctly.
Oh no, you don't. It just. Yeah.
Well, coming at this from a place of, I know enough Heidegger to be dangerous, but I'm less informed about scripture
Oh, you don't have to be informed about scripture. People that know scripture are informed about scripture. Right? The televangelists, you think they know that crap? No, man. They just need to make some money, dude.
Well, I like your bringing up of the core, because I think that's a certain interesting sort of strategic criticism of how we even, if the sort of problem that you laid out with Dasein as operating through a disclosure of how can you even sort of demarcate the horizon, demarcate what's beyond the horizon, if you are sort of being in the world in this way. I think the interesting question for me is when talking about like the process of relation, that's a process, at least in my understanding, described through scripture, text, but also through oral process, and that raises the question of interpretation, right? It raises the question of how you interpret these texts, how you understand what revelation is, how you interpret even any of the theologians one might read, and that I don't know. There are a lot of interesting problems I feel like with. It seems like if there's agency outside of being, then like getting at it through interpretation, through people, beings who are interpreting. I don't know how you step outside of the being mode into the realm of the divine.
Well, that's a great question. And I think Kant had the answer, because he always does, right? Kant's always got the answer. Whenever we're confused, we just look to Kant, right? But Kant, I mean, if you look at Kant, his deontological method of ethics says it all. Because basically, deontology simply means that which is outside of what we can know to be reality. It's the non-being, right? But it still permeates through action. So revelation is not an orthodoxy as much as an orthopraxy. It's how something, and if you want to look at it from an apophatic perspective, I know we talked about apophaticism a little bit, and obviously there's some pushback on how that's understood. But how the divine speaks to us, and how the divine kind of presses us toward understanding what right and wrong is. Now, Kant, of course, felt that it was rooted in reason. You had, the right, the true, which some theologians see as being God. So the right thing to do, the correct thing to do, the rational thing to do, which some people might reflect as God, is not something you can observe in reality. It's not experience. It's outside of it. That's where we get obligations and things like that. So I think the best way to understand it is that it isn't something that we can see around us or experience. It's something that is felt. And that's a great thing too. That's a great point too, because oftentimes with theology we have it the other way around. Because what we're doing is we're trying to look for God around us, whereas in my view, we just use the term God to explain what we all feel, which is that like love, that sense of connection, right? It doesn't, and like an atheist, for example, are still going to have the same like tendency to treat people kindly, right? They're still going to have the same tendency to want to commune with people and have a community and all these things. Now, as far as what happens after death and all these sorts of things, obviously they're not going to have an answer for it. The Christian's not going to have an answer for it because it's the horizon. Heidegger would say, why are you even talking about that? You should be talking about what's going on now, because that's something that happens after, and we can't really connect with the now, with the action, because it's non-being, or that's the conception of non-being. For example, if you were to say, let's talk about death, for example. Death is a phenomenological apprehension of non-being, so throughout your life. But that's just your life. If it is possible that there's life after death, then we're using the term death in an inappropriate way, because we continue to live the entire time. It's just our mode of experience changes or alters or whatever. We just can't see past that time in the same normal way that we do in this particular sort of set of experiences. So that still doesn't solve the problem. Can we know there's life after death? You can, of course you can. But the point is, it doesn't matter, because what's most important is that we have obligations, Kantian obligations, and we have to fulfill those obligations. And those obligations are best understood in theological terms, and that's basically all I'm saying. I'm not saying that someone has to be religious or whatever. I'm just saying that it best is understood in those theological terms, even though a lot of people have captured and weaponized those terms to be like television. In fact, on the way here, it's so funny, I was talking to her about it. We flew over there, and we were in a plane, and And there's this really funny quote by this televangelist, and he was talking about how he was explaining why he had to have a private jet. I think his name's Kenneth Copeland. You guys heard of him? He said the reason he had to have a private jet because he just could not stand being in an airplane with all these people that were just evil and sinful. And it was like being in a tube of demons. When I was going there, I felt like, yeah, it's like a tube of demons, man. You're in a tube of demons. But the point is a lot of people weaponize, these theological terms. They don't have to be. There's many different traditions, and all those traditions can essentially come together and say many of the same things. The liberal Christian can come together with the atheist mystic who's just trying to get an experience through like doing DMT or something. I'm sick, dude, I'm telling you, man. So so they can all come together. In fact, there's a book by, you guys should look this up, a guy named John Gray. He's an atheist, but he has a book called 7 Types of Atheism. Brilliant. And he talks about how there should be some intersectionality between like the mystic traditions of Christianity. Maybe you see more in the East, like an Eastern Orthodox, which is great stuff, by the way, or the more mystical perspectives of Christianity, and with many types of atheists, like religious atheists. You even see Sam Harris going toward that. He's doing these, kind of mystical experiences, and he's not sitting in a sweat lodge, which would be kind of cool. I tried it once; it doesn't work. So, but anyways, that's what I would say to that. I think that it's more about taking these issues and understanding them from a theological perspective as opposed to a naturalistic perspective. Now, that's not saying that that's proof of God or whatever, because we're trying to reassess what the term God even means, just basically. And many of us would say that it's agency laden. But the point is I think that revelation in that sense. Now, Paul Ricoeur, obviously, he would be, and I don't want, I've studied Paul Ricoeur, but not extensively, so I don't know what he meant, but I would think, and this is my opinion, and based on his embedded theology, because he's probably, his tradition, the culture he came from, the church, was very literalistic, right? Which I love Roman Catholicism. It's great. Roman Catholicism is great. But I prefer the mystical side, right? But it's rule based, right? It's rule based. It's based on literal interpretations of Scripture and things like that. And I think he's referring more to that. I don't think he'd have a problem with a more liberal theological perspective that you've maybe seen Barth or some other modern theologians. There's a variety of different theologians. There's a guy I listened to, a preacher named Steve Shaw, great guy. He's very liberal. So basically a liberal theology. I don't have any problem with Revelation in that respect, but any more fundamentalist perspective, I think we would definitely have a problem. And I'm not arguing for that type. Somebody could map that onto this, and that's fine, but I'm not going to agree with them on many points. I'm going to be like, no, you're not going to hell because you think, or whatever, so. But, anybody else have any more questions?
I don't want to take too much more time, but I do have.
Oh, no, take it as much time.
Is Revelation in your sort of conception in this context?
Mm-hmm.
This might be a question that doesn't make any sense. Is
I
it
love
like
that.
an immediate mode kind of thing, or is it like an always ongoing process? Is it moments of revelation?
Ooh, that's brilliant. That's brilliant. Okay, that's a great point. And I've been working on my dissertation right now. I haven't got my doctorate yet. I'm slow. Almost there. Anyways, there's a woman named Jana Martinsovsky. Very good chance to read her. She has a book on metaphor and religious language. She identifies 2 types: pointed and diffuse. In fact, I brought this up to her. I was emailing her. She's like, I didn't say that. I was like, here's the quote. She's like, oh my gosh, I forgot about that. She totally forgot about this aspect of her philosophy. But anyway, she identified 2 different types of religious experience: pointed and diffuse. Pointed is, okay, I'm on the top of this mountain and I feel God around me. I feel love. I feel whatever. That's pointed. Diffuse is a conceptual understanding, like when you say, God is the means by which I understand this. God is the reason why I have hope in my life. That's not an individual experience. That's me reflecting on it. So I would say you have 2 different types. I would say that both would be relevant to Revelation. I think that the divine reveals itself through a variety of ways, whether it's conceptually, or whether it's through individual experiences that maybe you can't even say. It's just, I don't even know. Like, dude, you go, just walk around this freaking college, dude, it's beautiful. I mean, like, you know, I feel religious. Yeah, I walked into the, what's that, the chapel, yeah. We walked into the chapel, and I swear I heard a ghost, man. I think it's haunted there, man. But anyways, but you get this sense of this otherness, this divine, and I can't describe it. It goes beyond my ability to describe it. So that would be more pointed. It's like, boom, that's, or a drug, maybe a drug addict who comes to, he comes to a point where, well, I can't do this anymore, and they feel this, maybe it's their mother, or whether it's a particular person in their life, they don't want to let them down, and they feel that person's sort of character is pressing in on them, right? In a sense, that could be God speaking to them, but that they can't describe it, but they know that they need to stop because they don't want to let whatever is down. That would be more pointed. So I like the Saskaisian term. I made that word up. Look her up, Jan Martin Saskis. But anyways, I like her language of distinguishing between different types of religious experience, which would be pointed and diffused, or the apophatic, sort of mystical. I can't explain it. It's not conceptual, very existential, very personal. Whereas the diffused is the more conceptual. It's the stuff we can talk about, right? The stuff we can talk about, and then we can get into different religious traditions like Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, the Sufists, and all these beautiful traditions that have ways of expressing that religious experience that they have. So that's what I would say. You have two different types of religious experience. Anybody have any other questions? That's all I got. It's about time. It was fun.
Very nice.
Dude, this guy hung out with Gather, dude. I can't believe it. I'm blown away. I'm just like, whoa. Like, that's great, man. Yeah. Is he cool? Oh man, I love it. I would love to have met him. I'm gonna tell the president of my college that I know a guy that met Gather. He's gonna be very impressed.
But who?
Gadamer. Yes.
Gadamer sat at my table in my apartment, and the table was not bigger than that.
Oh, really?
For the
I remember
he was such a humble man.
Gosh, that's awesome, man. That blows me. What's your name?